In the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, along the quiet banks of the Inn River, on a cold April morning in 1889, a boy was born who would later become one of history's most infamous figures, Adolf Hitler. The world would come to know him as a man whose ideas and ambitions would plunge nations into chaos, yet his beginnings were as unremarkable as those of any other child. His father, Alois Hitler, was a stern and often volatile customs official whose rigid discipline and unpredictable temper shaped young Adolf's early understanding of authority and obedience. His mother, Clara, was gentle, devoted, and indulgent, shielding him from the harsher aspects of his father's discipline. The contrast between his parents created a tension in Adolf's childhood that would follow him for decades, leaving him both sensitive and dangerously ambitious. From an early age, Adolf exhibited a peculiar combination of traits. He was meticulous, often absorbed in drawing and painting, showing an early fascination with images of military parades, soldiers, and monuments. Yet he was also intensely private, prone to fits of anger and frustration when reality failed to meet his expectations. School offered no solace. He struggled under the rigid authority of his teachers, who failed to recognize his talent and dismissed him as a daydreamer. Yet even as a boy, Adolf was ambitious. He fantasized about glory, about leaving an indelible mark on the world. This yearning for recognition would later metastasize into something far darker. The death of his father when Adolf was 13 was a turning point. The tyrannical figure who had inspired both fear and fascination was gone, and the protective presence of his mother became the central axis of his young life. Clara's death, when Adolf was just 18, left a void that no amount of artistic aspiration or academic effort could fill. Hitler's early adulthood was marked by a restless wandering through Vienna, a city that offered both inspiration and disillusionment. He arrived with dreams of becoming a celebrated painter, only to be repeatedly rejected by the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. These rejections were more than professional setbacks. They were personal humiliations that fueled his sense of resentment and injustice. In Vienna, Hitler encountered a world of extremes. The city was a crucible of political ideas, nationalist fervor, and rampant anti-Semitism, where newspapers and pamphlets fanned the flames of ethnic and social prejudice. He absorbed these ideas voraciously, devouring writings on German nationalism, social Darwinism, and racial purity. At the same time, Vienna exposed him to the stark realities of poverty. He lived in boarding houses with other struggling artists, scrounged for food, and wandered the streets observing the city's marginalized communities. His early failures, combined with the ideologies he encountered, began to shape a worldview that was rigid, uncompromising, and dangerously extreme. World War I arrived as a pivotal chapter in Hitler's life. He volunteered for the Army of Germany, driven by a mixture of patriotic fervor and a desire for personal validation. The trenches of the Western Front exposed him to the horrors of modern warfare, artillery barrages, gas attacks, and the daily sight of death. Yet Hitler thrived under military discipline, earning both commendations and the Iron Cross for bravery. The comradeship of the battlefield, the sense of purpose, and the recognition he received stood in sharp contrast to the failures and humiliations of his earlier life. The war did more than define his military credentials. It cemented his belief in order, hierarchy, and the power of loyalty, and it deepened his resentment toward those he deemed weak or traitorous. The end of World War I was a crushing blow. Germany's defeat and the Treaty of Versailles ignited a storm of humiliation and anger across the nation, emotions that Hitler absorbed like a sponge. He became involved with radical political groups, joining the fledgling German Workers' Party, which would later evolve into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. His skills as an orator quickly elevated him, allowing him to captivate crowds with speeches that combined historical references, emotional appeals, and incendiary rhetoric. He learned to manipulate public sentiment, exploiting fears, prejudices, and frustrations to create a sense of collective purpose and destiny. Even in these early political years, Hitler was strategic and cunning. He recognized the power of symbols, uniforms, and propaganda, understanding that perception could be as important as policy. The swastika, the Nazi salute, and the spectacle of mass rallies were not mere theatrics. They were tools in a larger campaign to instill obedience, unity, and fervor. By combining personal charisma with meticulous attention to detail, he transformed a small fringe party into a growing political force, appealing to veterans, workers, and the disenfranchised alike. Hitler's rise was not instantaneous. The Weimar Republic was a turbulent and fragile democracy, racked by economic crises, political assassinations, and social unrest. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and the Great Depression created fertile ground for radical ideas. Hitler seized these moments, framing himself as both a savior and an avenger. His speeches promised a restoration of national pride, a return to traditional values, and the elimination of perceived internal threats. He painted enemies as scapegoats, primarily Jews, communists, and other minority groups, blaming them for Germany's misfortunes and mobilizing hatred into political power. By the early 1930s, Hitler's political calculations bore fruit. The Nazi Party became the largest faction in the Reichstag, and in 1933 he was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Yet his ascent to power was not the result of force alone. It was a complex interplay of propaganda, manipulation, legal maneuvering, and the exploitation of fear. Once in office, Hitler moved swiftly to consolidate authority, dismantling democratic institutions, silencing opposition, and creating a totalitarian state. The Reichstag fire, the Enabling Act, and the Night of the Long Knives were milestones in this transformation, each demonstrating his ability to combine violence, intimidation, and legal justification to achieve absolute control. Hitler's vision extended beyond politics. It encompassed culture, education, and society itself. He sought to mold the German people according to his ideals, controlling the arts, rewriting history, and shaping youth organizations like the Hitler Youth. His regime emphasized loyalty, conformity, and a mythologicized version of German heritage, while systematically dehumanizing those he considered undesirable. The machinery of propaganda, led by figures like Joseph Goebbels, ensured that every aspect of daily life reinforced the Nazi narrative, creating a society where dissent was dangerous and ideology was omnipresent. By the late 1930s, Hitler had embarked on a path of aggressive expansionism. The annexation of Austria, the Sudetenland crisis, and the eventual invasion of Poland demonstrated a calculated blend of diplomacy, intimidation, and military planning. Each move tested international resolve, revealing both the ambitions of the Führer and the weaknesses of those who opposed him. His vision was not merely territorial, it was ideological, seeking to reshape Europe according to his vision of racial hierarchy, national destiny, and historical destiny. Yet even at the height of his power, Hitler's life was a study of contradictions. He was both meticulous and obsessive, yet prone to irrational decisions. Charismatic and commanding, yet socially awkward in private. A military strategist in some contexts, yet reckless in others. He maintained a cultivated image of discipline and control, yet his personal life was marked by secrecy, manipulation, and indulgence. Understanding these contradictions is essential to understanding the man who would ignite one of the deadliest conflicts in human history.
When Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, many in the world dismissed him as a temporary political figure, an outsider who had ridden a wave of populism, but who would soon be restrained by the institutions of the Weimar Republic. What few realized was that Hitler's entire career had prepared him for this moment, and he was determined never to relinquish power once it was in his grasp. From the very beginning, Hitler projected confidence and inevitability. His speeches declared that Germany was at the dawn of a new era, one that would cleanse the nation of weakness and restore it to greatness. But behind the soaring rhetoric was a cold and calculated plan: dismantle democracy, eliminate enemies, and fuse the machinery of state with the ideology of National Socialism. The turning point came quickly. On the night of February 27, 1933, the German Parliament building, the Reichstag, went up in flames. A Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested and blamed for the fire. Hitler and his allies seized on the event with ruthless efficiency. To them, it was not just an act of arson. It was proof, at least in the propaganda they spread, that Germany was under immediate threat from communists, anarchists, and enemies of the people. The very next day, President Paul von Hindenburg signed the Reichstag fire decree drafted by Hitler's inner circle. This decree suspended civil liberties, allowing police to search homes, seize property, censor the press, and detain individuals without trial. Overnight, Germany transformed into a police state. Communists, Social Democrats, and anyone suspected of opposing the Nazis were arrested en masse. By creating an atmosphere of fear and urgency, Hitler had turned a crisis into an opportunity for power. Yet the Reichstag fire was only the beginning. Hitler needed something more permanent, something that would allow him to legislate without opposition. That opportunity came with the Enabling Act, passed on March 23, 1933. The Enabling Act gave Hitler the legal authority to enact laws without the approval of Parliament or the President. It effectively dismantled democracy, concentrating legislative and executive power into Hitler's hands. In the Kroll Opera House, where the Reichstag had temporarily convened, Hitler delivered a speech that mixed promises of renewal with thinly veiled threats. Surrounded by stormtroopers and SS guards, most members of Parliament felt they had no choice but to comply. Only the Social Democrats dared vote against it. With the Enabling Act, Hitler no longer had to maneuver within the constraints of law. He could dictate it. This was the foundation of the Nazi dictatorship. Once in control, Hitler moved systematically to crush opposition. Trade unions were dissolved, their leaders imprisoned or sent to concentration camps. All other political parties were banned, making the Nazi Party the only legal political organization in Germany. Newspapers, radio, and literature fell under strict censorship, overseen by Joseph Goebbels, who became Minister of Propaganda. Goebbels was a master of modern media. He understood that propaganda was not just about information, but emotion. Posters, films, and newsreels glorified Hitler as the savior of Germany, while vilifying Jews, communists, and foreigners as parasites and threats. The Nazi regime created a culture of spectacle: mass rallies at Nuremberg, choreographed marches, and the uniformed presence of stormtroopers in every city and town. The goal was simple: make the people believe that Hitler was not just a leader, but a destiny. Still, Hitler's grip on power was not absolute. Within his own movement, factions threatened to challenge him. The SA, or Sturmabteilung, had been crucial in bringing the Nazis to power, but by 1934, its leader, Ernst Röhm, pushed for a second revolution that would replace the traditional German army with a people's militia loyal to the SA. This vision clashed with Hitler's need to secure the support of the military elite, whose backing was essential for his long-term goals. In June 1934, Hitler acted. In what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler ordered the purge of Röhm and the SA leadership. Over several days, squads of SS officers hunted down not only SA members, but also conservative critics, rival politicians, and anyone seen as a potential threat. The purge eliminated internal dissent and won Hitler the gratitude of the German army, which now pledged loyalty to him personally. It also sent a chilling message: opposition, even within the party, meant death. The final step in Hitler's consolidation of power came in August 1934 with the death of President Hindenburg. Instead of calling for elections, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer and Reich Chancellor. The army swore an oath not to the German Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself. Germany was now a one-man dictatorship. Every lever of power, political, military, cultural, was in Hitler's hands. With opposition silenced and power secured, Hitler turned to the task of reshaping German society. The Nazis sought to control every aspect of life: politics, culture, education, even leisure. Youth organizations indoctrinated children from an early age, teaching loyalty to Hitler and the superiority of the Aryan race. Textbooks were rewritten to reflect Nazi ideology, glorifying German history while demonizing Jews and other minorities. The Nazi regime created a culture of spectacle: mass rallies at Nuremberg, choreographed marches, and the uniformed presence of stormtroopers in every city and town. The goal was simple: make the people believe that Hitler was not just a leader, but a destiny. Internationally, Hitler carefully crafted his public image. He talked peace while increasing his military strength. The road ahead. By the mid-1930s, Hitler had achieved what few thought possible. In just 2 years, he had transformed Germany from a struggling democracy into a totalitarian state, where opposition was crushed, society was indoctrinated, and the Führer's word was law. When Adolf Hitler secured absolute power inside Germany, he turned his eyes toward Europe with ambitions that few at the time could fully comprehend. He had rebuilt the nation's confidence, controlled the press, silenced his enemies, and convinced millions of ordinary citizens that he alone carried the destiny of the German people. Yet, in the private corridors of the Reich Chancellery, his conversations revealed a vision that went far beyond national revival. He spoke of Lebensraum, living space for the German people, expansion that would not only restore past glories, but carve out a vast empire to rival Rome itself. Every step he took from this moment forward was calculated to bring him closer to that goal. The first test came in 1936 with the reoccupation of the Rhineland. According to the Treaty of Versailles and later agreements, German troops were forbidden to enter this demilitarized zone along the French border. The restriction was a constant reminder of Germany's defeat, a humiliation that Hitler could not tolerate. Against the advice of his cautious generals, he ordered German troops to march into the Rhineland. They carried only light weapons, with orders to retreat if France resisted. But France did nothing. Britain issued only mild protests. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Hitler later admitted that had the French army advanced even slightly, Germany would have withdrawn in disgrace. Instead, he gained immense prestige, convincing the German people that destiny itself was on his side. The failure of the Western powers to act emboldened him further. By now, Mussolini's Italy had also moved closer to Germany, forming the Rome-Berlin axis. Hitler skillfully presented himself as a bulwark against communism, exploiting the fear of Bolshevik revolution that haunted much of Europe. At the same time, he began cultivating a personal myth as not only a German savior, but a European statesman, a man willing to negotiate, to sign agreements, to shake hands in front of cameras, all while preparing his nation for war. Austria was the next step. Hitler's birthplace held a symbolic place in his imagination. He believed that all Germans should be united under one Reich. Throughout the 1930s, Austrian Nazis, encouraged and funded from Berlin, created unrest within their country, undermining the fragile government in Vienna. In March 1938, German troops crossed the border without resistance. Crowds in Vienna and other Austrian cities greeted them with flowers and salutes, though beneath the cheering were many who feared the consequences. Hitler entered Vienna in triumph, standing before massive crowds, proclaiming the Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria. The Western powers again did nothing. For Hitler, it was proof that boldness brought rewards, and hesitation by his enemies only paved the way for further conquest. After Austria, his eyes turned to Czechoslovakia, particularly the Sudetenland, home to a large German-speaking population. He claimed that Germans there were mistreated and oppressed, using their plight as a pretext for aggression. In March 1938, the world watched as tensions escalated toward war. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew to meet Hitler, desperate to avoid conflict. The result was the Munich Agreement, a document that Hitler signed with a smile, promising peace in exchange for the Sudetenland. Chamberlain returned to London declaring "Peace for our time," waving the paper in triumph. But to Hitler, the agreement was not a final settlement, only a stepping stone. Within months, German forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, shattering the illusion that he sought only limited revision of borders. Each success fueled his belief in his own destiny. Each concession by Britain and France deepened his conviction that they lacked the will to resist him. The German people, dazzled by the apparent bloodless victories, hailed him as a genius, a leader who achieved through diplomacy and intimidation what others had failed to achieve through war. Yet, behind the curtain, preparations for actual war were intensifying. The German military expanded at a pace that violated every treaty restriction. Factories turned out weapons and tanks in secret, and youth were trained to see themselves as soldiers of a future empire. Inside Hitler's inner circle, debates about timing and strategy filled the air, but the Führer tolerated no doubt. He declared that Germany must expand eastward, into Poland, into the Soviet Union, into lands that he believed were destined to be ruled by Germans. His language grew harsher, his speeches more threatening. He spoke openly about the annihilation of enemies, about racial destiny, about history's demand for struggle and conquest. His audiences roared in approval, convinced that they were part of something greater than themselves, something that would lift their nation above all others. The Western powers could no longer ignore the threat, yet they remained uncertain, still clinging to the hope that Hitler's ambitions had limits. They did not yet understand that for him there were no limits. Each victory confirmed his belief that fate was on his side, that Providence had chosen him to reshape Europe, perhaps the world. By 1939, his attention fixed firmly on Poland. Secret negotiations with the Soviet Union led to the shocking Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement that divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. With Stalin's temporary cooperation secured, Hitler had removed his most dangerous Eastern obstacle. On September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border in a coordinated assault of tanks, planes, and infantry. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, unleashed a level of speed and violence the world had never seen. Within weeks, Poland collapsed under the combined weight of German and Soviet invasion. Britain and France, forced at last to respond, declared war on Germany. What had begun as bold political maneuvers, calculated risks, and ruthless propaganda had now ignited the greatest conflict in human history. For Hitler, it was not a moment of hesitation, but of triumph. He believed his destiny was unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. The Third Reich was no longer a promise, but a force in motion, reshaping borders, rewriting laws, and preparing for domination. His people celebrated, his generals obeyed, and his enemies stumbled. Yet within this apparent triumph lay the seeds of unimaginable destruction. The war that had begun in Poland would spread across continents, engulfing nations and leaving scars that would last for generations. Thus the stage was set. Hitler had risen from failed artist to supreme ruler, from agitator in beer halls to architect of global conflict. He had taken Austria, destroyed Czechoslovakia, crushed Poland, and forced the world into war. His vision was no longer confined to speeches or propaganda posters. It was now written in fire, steel, and blood. The question that remained was how far he would go and how long the world could endure the storm he had unleashed.
The invasion of Poland was only the beginning, and with astonishing speed, Hitler's armies turned their attention westward. In the spring of 1940, the world watched in shock as German forces launched a campaign against Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a single day, its small army unable to resist the sheer force of German strategy. Norway resisted longer, aided by British forces, but within weeks, German troops had secured control of its ports and coasts. The lightning style of attack revealed a new type of warfare, one based on speed, coordination, and the ruthless use of modern technology. The world learned the name Blitzkrieg, and it became synonymous with German power. With the north secured, Hitler directed his generals toward the heart of Western Europe. On May 10, 1940, German forces struck Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, bypassing the heavily fortified French Maginot Line. Tanks and mechanized divisions poured through the Ardennes, a forest the French had considered impassable. Within days, the German army had encircled vast sections of Allied forces, cutting supply lines and creating chaos. The British Expeditionary Force and French troops retreated toward the port of Dunkirk, where a desperate evacuation began. Under heavy bombardment, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were rescued by a flotilla of naval vessels and civilian boats. To the German leadership, it was a missed opportunity for total annihilation, but to Hitler, it mattered little. France itself was collapsing. In June 1940, German forces marched into Paris. The world saw photographs of Hitler posing triumphantly before the Eiffel Tower, a moment carefully staged to project dominance. France, humiliated and broken, signed an armistice,
dividing the nation into German-occupied territory and the collaborationist regime in Vichy. In less than a year, Hitler had achieved what the Kaiser had failed to do in 4 years of the First World War. Europe trembled before him, and his people celebrated him as the greatest military leader in German history. But even as victory swept across the continent, Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, declared that Britain would never surrender, no matter the cost. Hitler hoped that Britain would negotiate, perhaps even accept peace terms, but Churchill's defiance enraged him. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, became his next ambition. Yet Britain's island position and powerful navy meant that German victory would depend on gaining air superiority. Thus began the Battle of Britain. Throughout the summer of 1940, waves of German bombers and fighters crossed the English Channel, aiming to cripple the Royal Air Force. At first, they targeted airfields and radar stations, but as the campaign dragged on, frustration led to bombing raids on London and other cities. Night after night, civilians huddled in shelters as bombs rained down. Yet Britain did not break. The courage of RAF pilots, immortalized as the few, turned the tide. German losses mounted, and by October, Hitler reluctantly postponed the invasion. For the first time, his seemingly unstoppable advance had been checked. Unable to conquer Britain, Hitler turned his attention eastward toward the Soviet Union. He believed that the real destiny of Germany lay not in the West, but in the vast lands of the East, where he envisioned a German empire built on the conquest of Slavic peoples and the destruction of communism. His obsession with Lebensraum and his hatred of Bolshevism combined into a single monumental decision: the invasion of the Soviet Union. Preparations for this colossal undertaking began even as Britain remained unconquered. Meanwhile, inside Germany, life under Nazi rule grew harsher. The persecution of Jews intensified, with discriminatory laws stripping them of rights, forcing them from jobs, schools, and public life. Ghettos were established in occupied Poland, where Jewish communities were crammed into walled-off districts, living under starvation and disease. The machinery of persecution was expanding, though the full horror of what it would become was still unfolding. Propaganda continued to glorify Hitler as a leader without flaw, a man guided by destiny. But beneath the surface, the regime relied increasingly on fear, surveillance, and brutality to maintain its grip. In Italy, Mussolini entered the war on Hitler's side, though his military campaigns faltered in Greece and North Africa. German forces were soon called to support their ally, extending the reach of Hitler's armies into the Mediterranean and Africa. The war that had begun as a European conflict was now spreading across continents, drawing in more nations and more peoples into its orbit. By 1941, Hitler stood at the height of his power. Nearly all of Europe lay under his control, from the Atlantic coast of France to the plains of Poland. His enemies seemed powerless to resist, and his people believed that nothing could stop the advance of the Reich. Yet even in triumph, he grew restless. He could not tolerate stalemate. Britain remained defiant, but Hitler dismissed it as irrelevant once the Soviet Union was destroyed. In his mind, the conquest of the East would secure Germany's dominance for generations, providing resources, land, and space for his vision of racial empire. Thus, as German soldiers celebrated victories and citizens filled city squares with parades and cheers, Hitler was already plotting the next move, a war of annihilation unlike any the world had ever seen. He believed it was his destiny to crush the Soviet Union, to rewrite history, and to fulfill the mission that had guided him from the very beginning. Few around him dared to question his judgment. His aura of invincibility, his success in defying the world's great powers, and his unshakable will convinced his inner circle that he could not fail. But destiny is never so simple. The decision to march into the Soviet Union would open a new chapter, one that would test the very limits of German strength and reveal the cracks within the dream of empire. The victories of 1939 and 1940, dazzling and swift, would soon give way to struggles measured not in weeks, but in years, not in triumph, but in blood and ruin. The storm Hitler had unleashed was only beginning to reach its full fury, and the world stood on the brink of destruction. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in human history began. Along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles, over 3 million German soldiers, supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft, surged across the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa had been set in motion, the campaign that Hitler believed would secure his empire for 1,000 years. The attack was sudden, vast, and devastating. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed, airfields bombed before planes could take off, and towns swallowed up by the relentless German advance. Hitler had promised his generals that the campaign would be short, that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, and in the opening weeks it seemed as though he might be right. The German army raced forward, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, tearing deep into Soviet territory. Cities such as Minsk and Smolensk fell quickly, their defenders overwhelmed. German propaganda celebrated the victories, showing maps of the Reich expanding eastward, while Hitler addressed the nation with triumphant words. In his mind, the destruction of communism was not only a strategic necessity, but a sacred mission, the fulfillment of his racial ideology. The Slavic peoples, he claimed, were destined to be ruled, their lands to be cultivated by Germans, their lives expendable in the service of the Reich. But the Soviet Union was not as weak as Hitler had imagined. Joseph Stalin, though caught off guard, refused to surrender. Factories were dismantled and moved east beyond the reach of German bombers. Entire populations were mobilized for war. Soviet soldiers fought with desperate courage, retreating but not breaking. And as the summer stretched on, the vast distances of the Russian landscape began to slow the German advance. Supply lines grew strained, soldiers exhausted, and tanks worn from endless marches over rough terrain. The brutality of the campaign shocked even seasoned observers. Behind the front lines, special units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the army, tasked not with military objectives, but with mass murder. In towns and villages across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, Jewish communities were rounded up and executed by the thousands. Men, women, and children were driven into fields and forests, shot and buried in mass graves. These killings were the early stages of what would become the Holocaust, a genocide unlike any the world had known. For Hitler, the war against the Soviet Union was not just about territory. It was a war of extermination, where ideology demanded annihilation. By the autumn of 1941, German forces reached the gates of Moscow. Victory seemed close, and Hitler announced to his inner circle that the Soviet capital would fall within weeks. Yet the weather began to turn. Rain turned the roads into oceans of mud, slowing tanks and trucks to a crawl. Then came the Russian winter, one of the harshest in decades. German soldiers, unprepared for the bitter cold, shivered in thin uniforms, their equipment freezing, their weapons jamming. Temperatures plunged far below zero, and frostbite claimed more lives than bullets. In December, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back from Moscow. It was the first major defeat of Hitler's war, shattering the illusion of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht through 2 years of triumph. The dream of a quick conquest had dissolved into the reality of a long and brutal struggle. Hitler raged at his generals, blaming them for setbacks, refusing to allow retreats, demanding that soldiers hold positions at any cost. His obsession with control grew deeper, his belief in his own intuition unshakable. He dismissed advice, insisting that his will alone could bend reality to his vision. As the war dragged into 1942, Hitler ordered fresh offensives, convinced that victory was still within reach. German armies turned south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The name itself became a matter of pride and propaganda. Hitler could not allow a city bearing Stalin's name to remain unconquered. The battle that followed would become one of the most brutal in human history. Stalingrad was reduced to rubble by relentless bombing, yet Soviet defenders clung to the ruins with extraordinary determination. Street by street, building by building, the battle raged, with soldiers fighting in cellars, staircases, and factories. German troops advanced, but every gain came at a staggering cost. Winter returned, and with it the Soviet counteroffensive encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping more than 250,000 soldiers inside the city. Supplies ran out, starvation set in, and disease spread through the ranks. Hitler refused to allow a retreat, declaring that the army must stand and die if necessary. By February 1943, the Sixth Army surrendered. It was a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, the first time an entire German field army had been destroyed. The myth of Hitler's invincibility was shattered both at home and abroad. For the first time, Germans began to whisper doubts, though fear still silenced open dissent. To the outside world, the defeat at Stalingrad was a turning point, proof that the Reich could be beaten, that Hitler's empire was not eternal. Even as the war in the East turned against him, Hitler escalated his war of extermination. The ghettos of Poland were emptied as Jews were deported to newly constructed extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. There, millions were murdered in gas chambers, their belongings stolen, their bodies burned. The Holocaust had become industrialized, a systematic genocide carried out under the guise of secrecy, but known by many within the Reich. Hitler never wavered, never questioned the morality of his actions. To him, it was the logical fulfillment of the ideology he had embraced decades earlier in the streets of Vienna. As 1943 unfolded, Germany's enemies grew stronger. The United States, now fully engaged in the war after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, poured its industrial might into the Allied cause. American tanks, planes, and supplies crossed the Atlantic, strengthening Britain and supporting the Soviet Union. In North Africa, German forces under General Rommel fought fiercely, but were overwhelmed, forcing a retreat that opened the way for an Allied invasion of Italy. For Hitler, the noose was tightening, but he refused to see it. He continued to believe that bold offensives could change the course of the war, that one more victory would restore momentum. His speeches still proclaimed triumph, his propaganda still promised destiny, but the tide of history was shifting against him. By the spring of 1943, the German Reich was fighting on multiple fronts, and the momentum of victory that had once seemed unstoppable was slipping away. After the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. Instead, he demanded another great offensive in the East, hoping to restore his prestige and cripple the Soviet army before it could recover. The plan was for a massive armored assault at a place called Kursk, where a bulge in the Soviet line presented what seemed like an opportunity for encirclement. The Battle of Kursk began in July and quickly escalated into the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of armored vehicles clashed across open fields, supported by waves of infantry and artillery. Hitler had staked his hopes on the power of new weapons, the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks, but the Soviets were ready. Their defenses were deep, layered with minefields, anti-tank guns, and trenches. The German advance ground to a halt, and within days the Soviets launched their own counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back. Kursk ended as another failure, and with it, Germany permanently lost the initiative on the Eastern Front. From that moment, the war became one of retreat, as Soviet forces drove westward, village by village, city by city, reclaiming the territory that had been lost. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the Allies were gaining strength. In July 1943, they invaded Sicily, and within weeks the island was in their hands. The invasion shook Italy to its core. Mussolini was overthrown by his own government, arrested, and replaced by leaders who quickly sought peace with the Allies. Hitler, furious at what he saw as betrayal, ordered German troops to occupy Italy and rescue Mussolini, installing him as the head of a puppet state in the north. Yet Italy's collapse meant that Germany now had to defend a new front, stretching from the Alps to the beaches of southern Italy against advancing Allied armies. Back in Germany, the war was taking a heavy toll on civilians. Allied bombers filled the skies, targeting factories, railroads, and cities. Hamburg was nearly destroyed in a firestorm that killed tens of thousands. By 1943 and 1944, Berlin was being bombed regularly, turning parts of the capital into rubble. Families lived in fear of air raids, nights spent in shelters, mornings spent counting the dead. Hitler insisted that such attacks only hardened German resolve, but privately, despair was spreading. Despite the worsening situation, Hitler's control over his inner circle remained absolute. He refused to trust his generals, often dismissing their advice, interfering with their operations, and issuing orders based more on his instincts than on military logic. His belief in his own genius had become a kind of prison, trapping him in illusions while reality slipped further away. The loyalty he demanded left no room for dissent. Those who questioned him risked dismissal, disgrace, or worse. Yet not all Germans remained silent. A small resistance grew within the military itself. Officers who had once served Hitler with devotion began to see him as a danger not only to Germany's future, but to its very survival. They whispered of plots, of removing him, even of assassination. The most famous attempt would come later, but already in 1943, the seeds of betrayal were being sown. The following year, 1944, brought the decisive turning point in the West. On June 6th, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in northern France. Operation Overlord, known to history as D-Day, marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire. Thousands of ships carried men and supplies across the English Channel, while paratroopers descended behind enemy lines. German defenses were strong, but they were stretched thin, and the sheer scale of the Allied assault could not be contained. By the end of the day, the Allies had secured a foothold in France. For Hitler, the invasion was both a personal insult and a terrifying reality. He had long boasted that the Atlantic Wall, a chain of fortifications along the coast, would make Europe impregnable. Now that illusion was broken. He raged at his generals, refused to believe reports, and clung to fantasies that the Allies might be driven back into the sea. But the Allies pressed forward, linking the beaches, pouring reinforcements ashore, and breaking out into the French countryside. Within weeks, Paris was liberated, and German forces were in retreat across Western Europe. While the Allies advanced from the west, the Soviets launched massive offensives from the east. By mid-1944, Soviet troops had reached the borders of Poland, destroying entire German armies along the way. Hitler demanded counterattacks that were impossible, ordering soldiers to hold positions long after retreat was the only sensible choice. Entire divisions were annihilated because he refused to yield a single mile. It was during this desperate time that a group of German officers decided to act. They had planned for months, believing that only Hitler's death could save Germany from total destruction. On July 20th, 1944, Colonel Klaus Stauffenberg carried a bomb into Hitler's headquarters at Rostenburg. The device exploded, killing several officers and wounding many more, but Hitler survived, shielded by a heavy wooden table and sheer chance. Furious, he unleashed brutal retribution. Thousands were arrested, many tortured, hundreds executed, including Stauffenberg himself. The failed plot only tightened Hitler's grip, convincing him that Providence had spared him for a greater purpose. Yet even Hitler could not deny the crumbling reality. In the east, the Soviets captured Warsaw, moving ever closer to German soil. In the west, Allied armies crossed into Belgium and the Netherlands. By late 1944, German forces launched a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, hoping to split the Allies and recapture momentum. At first, the surprise attack drove deep into Allied lines, but within weeks it was halted and thrown back. It was Germany's last gamble, and it had failed. By 1945, the Reich was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins, the economy shattered, the army broken. Hitler, increasingly isolated, retreated into his underground bunker in Berlin. There, surrounded by loyalists, he issued orders to divisions that no longer existed, dreamed of miracle weapons that would never arrive, and blamed his enemies, his generals, and even the German people for betraying him. He raged against reality, refusing to face the truth. The empire he had promised would last 1,000 years was crumbling after little more than a decade. And as Soviet armies closed in on Berlin from the east and Allied forces advanced from the west, the world prepared to witness the final act of Hitler's story, a descent into ruin, destruction, and death. By the beginning of 1945, the Reich was little more than a dying giant. Its armies were shattered, its cities bombed into rubble, and its people weary and starving. Yet Hitler clung to the illusion of victory, convinced that some twist of fate, some miracle, would yet turn the tide. He spoke of wonder weapons, rockets, jet aircraft, even rumors of secret bombs that would strike terror into his enemies and force them to negotiate. But these dreams were hollow. The factories lay in ruins, raw materials were scarce, and the soldiers who once carried his empire across Europe were now boys and old men pressed into desperate service. In January, the Soviet Union launched a massive offensive along the Vistula River, sweeping westward with unstoppable momentum. Entire German armies were smashed aside as the Red Army surged across Poland. Within weeks, they were at the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of cowardice, treason, and weakness. But the truth was undeniable. The Soviet juggernaut was at Germany's door. Meanwhile, from the west, the Allies advanced relentlessly. American, British, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine, pushing deeper into the heart of the Reich. Town after town fell, their inhabitants stunned to see enemy soldiers marching down their streets. For the first time in centuries, German soil was occupied by foreign armies, and the myth of invincibility that Hitler had cultivated dissolved into fear and despair. In the midst of this collapse, the horrors that had been hidden from much of the world were finally revealed. Allied soldiers liberated concentration camps, places like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen, where skeletal prisoners stumbled from barracks and piles of corpses bore witness to the scale of murder. What had been whispered and suspected was now undeniable. The Holocaust, the industrialized slaughter of millions of Jews, Roma, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable, lay exposed in all its horror. For Hitler, who had orchestrated and justified this genocide, there was no repentance, no pause. Even in his final days, he spoke of the extermination as necessary, a twisted fulfillment of his vision. By April, Berlin itself was surrounded. The city was once the symbol of his power, adorned with monuments and banners, but now it was a battlefield. Soviet artillery pounded the streets, reducing buildings to ruins. Tanks rolled through neighborhoods, while civilians fled into cellars, clutching whatever they could carry. Hitler had retreated into his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, a dim underground complex of concrete rooms where he would live his last days. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was one of denial and despair. Maps were spread on tables, but the armies they represented no longer existed. Reports from the front grew worse each hour, but Hitler refused to accept them. He demanded that divisions counterattack, that commanders hold their positions to the last man, that soldiers sacrifice themselves for a cause that was already lost. His voice grew hoarse from shouting, his body frail from illness, but his will remained unbent. To those who stood beside him, he appeared as a man possessed, unable to separate fantasy from reality. In those final days, a strange kind of court life unfolded underground. Eva Braun, his longtime companion, remained by his side, cheerful and devoted, as though the world above had not collapsed. Ministers and generals came and went, some still loyal, others planning their escape. Food grew scarce, the air thick with smoke and dust from constant bombardment. Yet Hitler continued to dictate orders, to deliver monologues about betrayal and destiny, to cling to the belief that fate had chosen him and would not abandon him now. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler marked his 56th birthday in the bunker. Outside, shells exploded across Berlin and Soviet troops pressed closer. Few came to offer congratulations. Those who did spoke in hushed voices, knowing that the end was near. Even then, Hitler refused to leave the city, declaring that he would stay in Berlin until the end, that he would not abandon the capital as others had fled. In the final week of April, as Soviet forces stormed through Berlin's streets, Hitler at last began to accept the inevitable. He spoke of his life, of the enemies who had defeated him, and of the German people whom he accused of failing to be worthy of his vision. He drafted a will, marrying Eva Braun in a brief ceremony, and appointing successors to carry on the remnants of his regime. His words were bitter, filled with accusations and self-justifications, but they revealed a man trapped in the prison of his own beliefs. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life in the bunker. With Soviet troops only blocks away, he took poison and shot himself, while Eva Braun also took poison at his side. Their bodies were carried up to the garden above, doused in gasoline, and burned in the shadow of the chancellery that once had been the seat of his power. The man who had promised a 1,000-year empire had ruled barely 12. His death did not bring peace immediately, but it marked the end of an era of destruction unlike any the world had known. In the days that followed, Berlin fell, Germany surrendered, and Europe began the long, painful process of reckoning with the devastation that Hitler had unleashed. Yet even in death, his shadow lingered. The ruins of cities, the graves of millions, the memories of those who survived bore witness to what one man's ideology, fused with power, could bring. For the world, Hitler's downfall was not only a moment of victory, but a warning, a reminder of the darkness that can grow when hatred is given the force of armies, and when fear silences resistance until it is too late.
When Hitler's body was consumed in flames in the Chancellery Garden, the empire he had forged was already collapsing in on itself. Berlin surrendered days later, on May 2, 1945, as Soviet troops swarmed through the ruins, raising their red flag over the Reichstag. In the West, German commanders signed unconditional surrender on May 7th, bringing the war in Europe officially to an end. What had begun as a vision of conquest and domination had ended in total ruin. Across Germany, cities lay in rubble. Dresden, Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin were shells of what they once had been, their streets filled with the homeless, the wounded, and the starving. Railways were broken, factories silent, bridges destroyed. Millions of German civilians wandered through the wreckage, searching for food, water, or word of missing loved ones. Entire families had been uprooted, displaced by bombing, fleeing from advancing armies, or driven from lands that had been part of Hitler's grand dream. The once proud Reich had become a graveyard. For the Allies, victory brought not only relief, but also horror. As their soldiers advanced deeper into Germany, they uncovered the full scope of crimes committed in Hitler's name. Concentration camps, hidden in forests and plains, were open to the world. At Dachau, American soldiers found thousands of corpses, starved prisoners who had been forced on death marches, and crematoria that still reeked of burned flesh. At Bergen-Belsen, British troops found tens of thousands of emaciated survivors, many too weak to stand, lying among unburied dead. The liberation of these camps revealed the industrial scale of the genocide that Hitler had designed and driven. 6 million Jews murdered,
alongside millions of others deemed enemies or undesirables. The shock was immense. Many had heard rumors, but few had imagined the reality. Newspapers published photographs of the camps, showing skeletal survivors staring blankly at the cameras, piles of bodies stacked like cordwood, mass graves unearthed by bulldozers. The world recoiled in disbelief and fury. Hitler's death had spared him from answering for his crimes, but those who had served him would not be so fortunate. In the months that followed, the Allies established tribunals to bring Nazi leaders to justice. The most famous of these were the Nuremberg trials, held in the very city where Hitler's rallies had once celebrated the power of the Reich. Now, in that same city, his surviving lieutenants sat in the dock accused of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. Men like Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Rudolf Hess faced the judgment of the world. Evidence was overwhelming. Documents, photographs, testimonies, and the accounts of survivors. The defense that they had merely been following orders was rejected. The trials were more than punishment. They were a reckoning. For the first time in history, leaders were held personally accountable for the destruction they had unleashed. 12 men were sentenced to death, others to long prison terms. Some, like Göring, cheated the gallows by taking their own lives, but most were hanged, their deaths quiet echoes of the millions who had perished under their rule. The Nuremberg trials became a milestone in international law, establishing principles that would shape the world's understanding of justice in the decades to come. Meanwhile, Germany itself was divided. The victorious Allies split the country into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, too, was carved into sectors, its ruins now watched over by former enemies turned uneasy partners. The ideological tensions that had been buried in the fight against Hitler soon emerged as the Soviet Union, bearing the scars of 27 million dead, was determined to spread its influence, while the United States and its allies sought to build a different future. Out of the ashes of Hitler's Reich, the Cold War was born. For ordinary Germans, survival became the first priority. Food was scarce, coal for heating even scarcer. Families bartered whatever they had, children scavenged in ruins, and women carried the burden of rebuilding shattered lives. Many struggled with guilt or denial, refusing to believe the full truth of what had been done in their name. Others turned their eyes forward, eager to leave behind the nightmare of the past. Hitler himself became a ghost in memory. Photographs of his rise and fall circulated, his speeches replayed as grim reminders of how one man had bent a nation to his will. His name became synonymous with evil, his story studied by historians, debated in classrooms, and remembered by survivors who bore the scars of his reign. To some, he remained a figure of fascination, the symbol of ultimate dictatorship. To most, he was a warning, a lesson carved in history about the dangers of unchecked power, of blind obedience, of hatred given authority. The ruins of the Reich stood as monuments to his failure. The grand boulevards he had imagined, the 1,000-year empire he had promised, the racial utopia he had dreamed, all lay in dust. What endured instead were the memories of war, the millions of dead, and the bitter truth that one man's ideology had nearly destroyed a continent. The world moved on, but it did not forget. In every trial, every memorial, every textbook, Hitler's name was remembered not as a hero or visionary, but as a destroyer, the architect of suffering on a scale never before witnessed. His story did not end with his death in the bunker. It continued in the lessons that nations drew from his crimes, in the vigilance that followed to prevent such darkness from rising again. The war was over, but Hitler's shadow lingered in ways that reached far beyond Germany's borders. In the United States, where returning soldiers brought back first-hand stories of combat and liberation, his name carried a weight that was both horrifying and fascinating. American newspapers and magazines published photographs of Hitler's bunker, the ruins of Berlin, and the camps that had been liberated. Families gathered around radios and in theaters to listen to or watch newsreels that showed the devastation in Europe, trying to grasp the scale of destruction one man had caused. For many Americans, Hitler became the embodiment of absolute evil. His speeches, filled with rage and venom, were replayed not as calls to action, but as warnings of how demagogues could manipulate crowds. Universities and schools began to study his rise, dissecting how a failed artist in Vienna had transformed into a dictator who plunged the world into its deadliest war. Politicians referenced him often, invoking his name as a caution against tyranny and extremism. In courtrooms, in Congress, and in newspapers, Hitler became the standard against which other threats were measured. But fascination went hand in hand with revulsion. American publishers quickly produced dozens of books about Hitler, biographies, psychological analyses, military histories. Some sought to explain how he had gained power, others to expose the crimes he had committed, others still to understand the man behind the myth. Hollywood followed, producing films that depicted him as a ranting, dangerous clown, or as a chilling symbol of hatred. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator had mocked him even during the war, but after his death, dramatizations turned darker, portraying him as the architect of unspeakable crimes. For American soldiers who had seen the camps, the images never left their minds. Veterans told their families, sometimes with words, often with silence, of what they had witnessed. The liberation of Dachau and Buchenwald became defining memories, shaping how Americans thought about the war. Hitler was not just a foreign dictator, he was the reason so many young men had crossed the ocean, fought, and died. He became the symbol of the evil they had defeated, the justification for the sacrifices that had been made. As the Cold War began, his name took on new layers of meaning. Politicians used him as a comparison whenever they wanted to warn about the dangers of totalitarianism, whether from fascism or communism. Hitler's story was told again and again in speeches, classrooms, and even comic books. Superman, Captain America, and countless American heroes in popular culture had fought against him, cementing his image in the imagination of a generation. Children who had not lived through the war still grew up with his name, taught to see him as the darkest figure in modern history. Scholars, meanwhile, dug deeper. Psychologists in America studied his personality, debating whether he had been insane, a sociopath, or simply a man whose hatred had been amplified by opportunity. Political scientists studied the Weimar Republic, asking how democracy had crumbled into dictatorship, seeking lessons to protect America's own institutions. Military strategists studied his campaigns, learning from his early victories and catastrophic mistakes. In every field, Hitler became a case study, a warning that was endlessly analyzed. Yet fascination sometimes blurred into darker curiosity. In the post-war years, a fringe of Americans flirted with neo-Nazi ideas, mimicking his symbols, parroting his rhetoric. They were small, often ridiculed and despised, but their existence showed that Hitler's poisonous ideology had not died completely with him. For the vast majority, however, he was remembered only as a warning, a figure whose legacy demanded vigilance. The American press frequently reminded readers of his atrocities, publishing survivor testimonies and photographs from the trials. School children saw images of camps and were taught about the Holocaust as a moral lesson. The phrase "never again" became a part of American vocabulary, a vow that the world would not allow another Hitler to arise. The memory of his crimes became part of America's identity as a global power, a justification for intervention abroad, for standing against tyranny wherever it appeared. In the arts, Hitler's image lingered as well. Writers portrayed him in novels that imagined alternate histories. What if he had won? What if he had lived longer? What if he had never been born? Such stories reflected both fear and relief. Fear of what might have been, and relief that reality had ended differently. Painters, filmmakers, playwrights, all grappled with how to represent him. Some chose caricature, others grim realism. But always his presence demanded attention, his story too immense to be ignored. In American culture, Hitler's legacy was paradoxical. He was both distant and immediate, a foreign dictator whose war had ended oceans away, yet also a figure who shaped the daily lives of millions of Americans in the years after 1945. He justified military alliances, influenced domestic debates about freedom and security, and lingered in every conversation about power and morality. His downfall was seen as proof of America's strength, his crimes as proof of the need for vigilance. Even decades later, his story refused to fade. Survivors of the Holocaust came to the United States, sharing their testimonies, building museums, and ensuring that the memory of his crimes remained vivid. American children walked through exhibits at the United States Holocaust Museum, seeing piles of shoes, photographs of lost families, and artifacts from camps, learning that Hitler's name was not only a symbol of war, but of genocide. For America, Hitler became more than a historical figure. He became a symbol etched into the national consciousness, a shorthand for ultimate evil, a reminder of what can happen when hatred and power unite. His legacy haunted textbooks, speeches, movies, and politics, ensuring that even in death, he remained one of the most recognized figures in human history. His story was retold endlessly, not to honor him, but to remind each new generation of what must never be repeated.
Hitler was dead. The war was over. Yet the echoes of his reign stretched far into the future. For decades after 1945, his name was spoken with a mixture of dread, fascination, and warning. His story was retold not because anyone wished to glorify him, but because forgetting him meant risking repetition. In America and across the world, his life became a study in how hatred, propaganda, and unchecked power could destroy entire nations. For survivors of his cruelty, the memory never faded. In displaced persons camps, in small towns across Europe, in new homes built in the United States and Israel, families carried the scars of what Hitler had ordered. The survivors' voices became living testimonies, their stories shaping how Americans understood not only the Holocaust, but also their own responsibility as a nation.
Teachers, writers, and activists insisted that the lessons of Hitler must be woven into every generation's education. The phrase, "never again," was not an abstract promise. It was born from the ashes of lives that had been consumed by his vision. American foreign policy, too, was shaped by him. Leaders pointed to his rise when justifying alliances and interventions. NATO was built in part to ensure that no tyrant could threaten Europe again. The Marshall Plan was launched with the recognition that economic despair had once fed Hitler's rise. When American presidents faced new enemies, from communist regimes to dictators in the Middle East, they often drew comparisons to Hitler, his shadow looming over every debate about freedom and security. His life was used as a measure of evil, a moral compass pointing to the dangers of silence in the face of tyranny. In culture, his image endured as both symbol and warning. Films, documentaries, and novels revisited his story repeatedly. Some explored his psychology, trying to uncover what made him so dangerous. Others reimagined history, asking chilling questions. What if he had won? What if the Allies had failed? What if his empire had lasted longer? Each retelling reflected both the horror of what was and the fear of what could have been. Even in parody or satire, he remained unsettling, his figure too bound to human suffering to be treated lightly. In Germany, his legacy became a burden that reshaped a nation's identity. For Americans, it was a cautionary tale of what happens when democracy falters and hatred takes root. His name became shorthand for dictatorship, his crimes the yardstick by which future atrocities were measured. The civil rights movement in the United States, too, drew lessons from his era, pointing out the dangers of prejudice and racism when left unchecked. Scholars compared Nazi ideology to systems of oppression at home, forcing America to reflect on its own contradictions. The fascination with Hitler extended to ordinary people as well. Decades after his death, American bookstores carried shelves of biographies, documentaries played on television, and debates continued in classrooms. Each new generation asked the same questions. How could one man gain such power? Why did millions follow him? Could it happen again? The answers were never simple, but the asking itself was proof of his lasting imprint on human thought. Even in the digital age, when the memory of World War II seemed distant to young people, his name remained one of the most recognized in history. On the internet, in documentaries streamed across the world, in debates about modern politics, Hitler's ghost lingered. Conspiracy theories twisted his story. Fringe groups tried to recycle his symbols, but mainstream culture held firmly to the truth of his crimes. Museums, archives, and survivors fought against distortion, preserving history so the future could not be misled. In America, his story found its place not only in history books, but in the national identity itself. The victory over Hitler was seen as proof of America's strength, a turning point when the nation had crossed the ocean and defeated tyranny. The war became part of the American narrative of heroism, sacrifice, and moral duty. Yet alongside pride was the sobering recognition that such evil had once flourished, reminding citizens to protect their democracy with vigilance. Hitler's death had ended his life, but not his influence. He became a warning etched into memory, a dark mirror showing humanity what it was capable of if hatred went unchecked. His story was not just German history or European history. It became world history, American history, human history. And in that story lay both terror and hope. Terror at the devastation he caused, hope in the resilience of those who survived, and in the unity of those who fought to stop him. As the years stretched into decades, his image did not fade, but hardened into symbol. He was no longer simply a man, but a representation of the darkest path humanity could take. Every time a politician abused power, every time hatred was preached, his name returned as a reminder. Every time freedom was defended, his memory served as proof of why the defense was necessary. His life and death stood as a monument of warning, ensuring that the world could never fully turn away. In the end, Hitler's story was one of destruction, but also of revelation. It revealed the fragility of civilization, the dangers of silence, and the resilience of those who resisted. For the United States, for Europe, for all who studied him, his rise and fall were more than history. They were a mirror held up to humanity, a mirror that reflected both the abyss of evil and the possibility of redemption. And so long as people told his story, examined it, and passed it on, the lessons of his life would remain, guarding the future against the shadows of the past.